Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk today about the challenges of finding the perfect images for the books we writers write. Can you all hear me? Am I loud enough? All of these, of course, are books that you, the readers, read. If you are a reader, then you understand how a good image adds so much to your pleasure when you are reading a book. This information is both for writers and for readers, because you as readers can also access the archives that we writers get our images from. My name is Nancy Marguerite Anderson, and I write books about the fur trade that existed in what is now British Columbia and Washington State in the years after 1821. My stories generally end about the same time as the gold rush stories begin in 1858. This image is of the Similkameen River Valley, one of my favorite places in British Columbia. My fur trade ancestor, Alexander Caulfield Anderson, rode through this trail many times on his way to Fort Hope from Colville, near modern-day Spokane. I've tried to take photos of this narrow valley, and I've never come up with one that does it justice. So I use this image with much pleasure, and only partly because it was taken by Charles Camsell, the son of an HBC gentleman who managed the northernmost Mackenzie River district of the HBC fur trade in the years 1870s, 1880s. The photograph was taken in 1908, so it was probably taken by a Kodak camera. I'll come back to the Kodak in a few minutes. To be clear, I am no expert on cameras. I own a modern camera or two, but I'm not even a good photographer. You certainly could not illustrate my books with the photographs I take. However, understanding what kind of cameras existed in the time period that I am researching or illustrating helps me to understand whether or not the photograph I am considering is a good representation of whatever it is I am illustrating. The earliest camera was the camera obscura. The words mean dark chamber. This simple illustration shows how a camera obscura works. It is basically a box with a hole with or without a lens at one end and a piece of paper at the other end, onto which the image was projected through the hole at the front end of the box. So we have an image inside the box shining onto a piece of paper. The paper was not film and it did not record the image. The so-called photographer had to climb inside the box and use a pencil to trace the outline of whatever was projected onto the piece of paper. Obviously, the camera obscura was not small. It had to be large enough to somehow hold one or two persons who were responsible for transferring the image onto the paper by tracing it. The earliest surviving photograph was a view from a window taken in France in 1826. The photographer used a camera obscura with a pewter plate covered in some kind of asphalt called bitumen of Judea. He exposed the coated pewter plate to sunlight for 8 hours and then washed off the hardened asphalt and got this image of a garden. At about the same time as this was happening, scientists began to play around with the knowledge that silver salts darkened when exposed to sunlight. And it resulted in something that actually resembled a photograph. Silver salts, such as silver nitrate or silver fluoride, were added to water, and the solution was painted on to whatever kind of plate the photographer wanted to preserve the picture on. (1839) is regarded as the official birth year of the camera we know today. Louis Daguerre developed a high contrast, sharp image with a camera that captured photographic images on a plate. In the early days, this type of camera used long exposure times, anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes. In 1841, a newly invented camera used silvered copper plates, which brought exposure time down to 3 minutes. This is a daguerreotype. The woman is Victoria Burney, and she is the much younger sister of my great-grandmother. In the 1850s, the process replaced the copper plates with thin glass plates that were coated with a solution of silver salts and exposed while still wet. One of the earliest photographers in Victoria that used the daguerreotype process was George Fardin, who arrived here in 1858. The first camera arrived in the Caribou in about 1866 with two photographers, Frederick Daly and Charles Gentile. I write a lot about the Caribou. The photographers were only there for a short time, a matter of a few years. Frederick Daly took this photograph of the Nicoamen River, where the BC gold rush was said to have begun. The cameras they used were handsome, light-tight wooden boxes with a simple lens. Early emulsions were not fast enough to require a shutter, so the photographer simply removed the lens cover and replaced it when enough time had passed. Boxes of glass plates, bottles of fresh water, chests of chemicals were carried everywhere, unpacked and repacked many times in their journeys north. The glass plates were prepared with a solution just before use, and the films were developed immediately after exposure. So a portable developing room was part of the equipment the two photographers carried with them. And the photographers needed to work when it was hot, when it was cold, when it was raining, dusty, and windy. In other words, any photographer who took up producing images in the Caribou was crazy, but they were also there. Now we come to the type of camera that took the Similkameen River image in 1908, the first image I showed you. Things changed for the better in the 1880s when George Eastman made photographic film, first out of paper and then out of celluloid, pardon me. Eastman's first camera, called a Kodak, was offered for sale in 1888. It came preloaded with film for 100 exposures, but had to be sent back to the factory for processing of the images and the reloading of another roll of film. It was not fast. It was convenient only to a point, and there were periods of time when the camera was at the factory. Cameras did improve over time. By 1905 or so, a French luxury goods company sent a photographer out to take images of fur trade life on Canadian rivers. The company was called the Revlon Frères, and it competed directly with the Hudson Bay Company for furs, which they made into fur coats they sold in their stores in Paris and New York. Many of the images I used in the York Factory Express came from this fur trading company, and their collection of images is, for the most part, in the Glenbow archives. So there are images to be found even if they are not taken in the time that the author writes about. That is, for me, the 1840s and the 1850s. The problem is not so much that the images don't exist. The problem is finding good images that will work in the books. Part of the solution is paintings. A number of painters came west over the mountains to Fort Vancouver in what is now Washington State. These artists traveled around the district, painting what they were most interested in. In Paul Kane's case, he painted the Indigenous peoples on the Columbia River and the First Nations near Fort Victoria. One of his most interesting paintings is that of the Salish wool dog that the First Nations people on the coast raised and literally farmed. Notice the dog and the loom. The blankets the First Nations people wove from the hair they collected from these long-haired dogs were everywhere on the coast and in the interior. Robert Campbell, who set up Fort Selkirk on the Yukon River in 1848, had difficulty selling his own British woolen blankets to the Northern Tachoni, who lived there, because these dog and goat hair blankets were carried from the coast and over the mountains to the Yukon River by the Tlingit Chilkats, who traded them directly to the Northern Tachoni. So Paul Kane's paintings are worth investigating if you are writing about the lower Columbia River and Fort Victoria in the 1840s. His paintings of Fort Victoria and of boat encampment at the Big Bend of the Columbia River are worth discovering. Those of you with very good eyes will spot in these two illustrations, will spot an octopus bag, a sash, and a Columbia boat upturned, among other things. These images come from the Royal Ontario Museum, and archives I haven't much explored because the images of BC that belong to them are mostly available in the BC archives. Or so I thought. To access the Royal Ontario Museum, go to ROM Online Collections. At this point, I clicked on Canada. Search box says I'm looking for. Enter Paul Kane. You will come up with a few images of Paul Kane's work and some of the objects he collected while on his journeys. But the next page goes on to other artists. So I tried boat encampment and got the image I was looking for. Click it until it enlarges, and there is a little download arrow that you will see in the top left corner that you can download the image. When I entered Fort Victoria, I got an image of Macaulay's Point with the Sook Hills in the background. Paul Kane's spelling was quite imaginative, and he called the Sook Hills the Snook Hills. This is a museum that is fast and very responsive. It's an easy one to search. The images are intended only for research. For publishing, as in all archives, you will order high-resolution images and pay for permission to use them. Play around with the search box. I am using the search for the Similkameen River as a sort of test for each of these sites. I entered Similkameen River in the search box and, not surprisingly, got nothing. So as long as I am complaining about the images I didn't find in time to put into the York Factory Express, here's another collection I should have looked at. I stumbled onto it by accident after the book was published. It is the Columbia Basin Institute. Sorry. Burning. Okay, this is the Columbia Basin Institute of Regional History. The Columbia Basin Image Bank, which is their collection of photographs, is a partnership between the Columbia Basin Institute and a wide number of individuals and societies in the region. The Institute represents museums and archives in Cranbrook, Kimberley, Castlegar, Moyi, Golden, and Rossland, as well as in Valemont, which is up in the Yellowhead Pass. The collection is designed to be web accessible. If you are writing or researching local history in Eastern British Columbia, this collection of photographs is well worth looking at. I was, oh.
Bear with us for a moment.
Have we lost contact with it?
There we go.
Good.
Which one do you need?
The next one. Perfect. Thank you. Where am I? I was interested in the Athabasca Pass and found these images in their collections. Someone actually climbed to the top of the mountain that overlooked Athabasca Pass, and they took these photographs. The first is looking east into Alberta, showing the long, narrow, winding valley of the Whirlpool River that leads the HBC men away from Athabasca Pass. The Whirlpool joins the Athabasca River and brings the men to Jasper House.
Did you find the question? What year was this?
Pardon?
What year?
Oh, I don't remember. It'll probably say in the site, but I didn't make a note of it.
No problem.
But it hasn't changed much. Athabasca Pass is Athabasca Pass. I was interested in the Athabasca Pass, and this is the Wood River that the HBC men followed north from the Big Bend of the Columbia River to reach the base of the Big Hill that would lead them up to and over Athabasca Pass. Coming home, the Wood River would lead the HBC men back to the Columbia River at its Big Bend, where they had earlier stashed their boats and provisions. The images from this collection are $16 a piece, either digital or photographed. It's a really good collection, even modern, fairly modern. And the next image I'm going to show you is a painting of Athabasca Pass itself, just so you know how difficult the climb was. I don't know which side of the pass the painting was drawn from, but it might have been the HBC's gun encampment, now called Cane Meadow, on the Alberta side of the mountains. It is painted by Henry James Warr, who arrived at Fort Vancouver, Washington on August the 26th, 1845. He and his companion, Mervyn Vavaswa, visited the Willamette Valley south of Fort Vancouver. They went down the Columbia River to its mouth, where Warr painted the HBC's Fort George, Astoria, where my great-great-grandfather worked for so many years. Then they traveled through the Cowlitz Valley to Fort Nisqually on Puget Sound and across the Straits of Juan de Fuca to Fort Victoria, where Warr painted the then 3-year-old fort. Then back to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, where they sat around waiting for the endless winter to go away. They went out in the outgoing York Factory Express of 1846, and on his way up the river, War painted a number of historical images of the river as it was in 1846. As you know, it's all underwater now. It's an important contribution to our local history and to that of Washington State, where the HBC had its headquarters. War's paintings are found in a number of archives. BC Archives, for example, and the Royal Ontario Museum. Library and Archives Canada is where I accessed most of his images, but also some are found in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society. So let's talk about the American Antiquarian Society. One of the Henry James War images on this site is an early painting of an image I also found in Library and Archives Canada. This painting shows the HBC men climbing up the big hill from the Wood River to the top of the plateau, just south of Athabasca Pass. It was steep, slippery, and generally snow-covered climb in the springtime, which is when War traveled out with the York Factory Express. Now, you want attractive, well-designed images in your book. This version of his painting is clumsy and not well designed. In his later version, that is the Library and Archives Canada version, War removed the clumsy tree in the middle of the image. This is the same image as above, but improved. That's why it's a good idea to research all the images ahead of time so that if you find a better image than the one you have, you can order it. It takes longer to do this and to sort them out and to decide on which is best, but it's worth it. Sometimes cost is an issue. For the HBC Brigades and for a book in the future, I ordered 2 high-resolution photos from the American Antiquarian Society, and they cost me $201. In comparison to Canadian sites, the American Antiquarian Society images are high-priced, although I don't know if they're higher priced than other American sites. However, like all the other archives I visit, you can download lower resolution JPEG images for free as part of your research. So begin your search in the general catalog by Googling American Antiquarian Society General Catalog. I got to the search page quickly and just as a test, searched for Similkameen River and got nothing. War by itself found me nothing. I got to the war images by entering War Henry James, and even then I scrolled halfway down the page to find his images. I tend not to read instructions.
Nancy, where is boat encampment? Or where was it?
Big Bend of the Columbia River. I tend not to read instructions, which probably contributes to the problems I have with sites like this, with every site. On this occasion, I did. The instructions are really simple and rather obvious. When I searched under name tab and Kane Paul, I at least found information on him in the form of books that can be downloaded, although no images. So knowing there was a better way to search for the Similkameen River, I went back to the general catalog, clicked subject, and searched. I got a better result that made more sense, but there was still nothing on the Similkameen River itself. So enough of the American Antiquarian Society. Seeing as I have already spoken of the Library and Archives Canada site, let's go there. They have tons of images, documents, photographs, but also many Henry James War paintings. This is one of them, Death Rapids, or Les Dalles des Morts. Thomas Lowe described the descent of this part of the upper Columbia River in his journals. Just so you know, Men who were new to the territory were often frightened by the violence of the Columbia River rapids, as you will see. Ran the St. Martin's Rapid early, he said, and breakfasted a short distance above the Rapid des Morts. In running the latter, Pierre's boat took in a good deal of water as he had to run straight through the middle of the heavy waves, not being able to put into the eddy on account of the awkwardness of the crew, who were too frightened to do as they were ordered. You can follow the entire length of the American and Canadian Columbia River from Fort Vancouver to boat encampment and beyond in War's paintings. Library and Archives Canada is easy to find, easy to navigate, and they have excellent images that will cover all of Canada, including the Arctic. I find Library and Archives Canada by Googling Library and Archives Canada, and it will bring you straight to the search page. Do a search in collections, it will likely find nothing, but it will lead you to the page where you can change the All tab to images in the tabs at the top of the page. Be somewhat specific in your descriptions, not just Yukon, but Yukon River, for example. Their images are not expensive. However, my recent experience has been that they take a long time to get the images to you. For my last order, it seems the delay was caused by the agency that digitizes the images, collects payment, and delivers them. I think they have a ton of work to do. They are short-staffed and they are having problems keeping up, so be patient. And it was also just after the pandemic. So anyway, I decided to search Library and Archives Canada for some new images for my next book. It is about 3 journeys north to the Arctic Ocean, and it includes the old fur trade route to Portage la Loche and beyond. It also includes journeys up the Liard River to Francis Lake and overland to the Pelly River in the Yukon and downriver to Robert Campbell's Fort Selkirk. The book also includes the stories of James Anderson, who in 1855 was sent north up the Great Fish River to discover what had happened to Sir John Franklin's lost men. This is one of the few journeys north that is rarely, if ever, mentioned in all the books written about Sir John Franklin. Even though Anderson was unsuccessful in finding any direct information, he was only 5 miles away from Starvation Cove, when he was forced to turn back. On a later occasion, he and his men were only a few miles from the place where the last man was said to have died. His men knew, but they didn't tell him. They wanted to go home. It was only August, and winter was already setting in. If you want to understand exactly why James Anderson's men wanted to leave, this is what the weather was like. So as you can see, I found some images that I really liked. I'm not going to have any trouble illustrating the book. And I haven't even searched in the Yukon archives, which is quite a good archives, or the Glenbow for that matter. So speaking of the Glenbow Museum and Archives is in Calgary, but it has plenty of images of BC and of places east of Alberta too. I used a lot of their images in the York Factory Express. And when during the pandemic, I needed 6 more images immediately, I ordered them from the Glenbow. The first thing to know about this archives is that it is closed for renovations beginning in 2020 or so. In 2022, the images from the old Glenbow Museum photograph database were moved to the University of Calgary's online digital collections website. I remember people on Twitter at that time saying that it was an end of a great archives, but it isn't. The University of Calgary is doing an excellent job. However, at first I found their website impenetrable. I couldn't get through the first layer into the images, and so I emailed them. Talk to the archivists. They will always help you. I remember people, and so here's what you do. Go to digitalcollections.ucalgary.ca. Go to collections at the side of the page when I last looked. Then the search bar in the middle of the page, I had no hits on my first search, so I applied filters, black and white, images, horizontal, which works for me. You probably want to do that because there are 117,354 images in their collection. And your first search goes through every single image. I searched the Similkameen River and found a picture taken at Princeton, a town actually on the Similkameen River. I searched the York boats, and all my old images that I used in the York Factory Express popped up. So easy to use when you understand how to get where you want to go. I also discovered that in the Glenbow archives, there are collections of various barren lands, barren grounds expeditions. As James Anderson crossed the barren lands to get to the Arctic Ocean in 1855, I needed some of those images. The Harry Snyder Barren Lands Expedition funds was the result of an exploration done in July and August of 1935. Snyder was investigating the musk ox and the caribou populations in the Mackenzie district of the Northwest Territory, particularly in the area north of Great Slave Lake, which is exactly where James Anderson was. This photograph of the musk ox is just, it's wonderful. Check farms. This man moved to the Canadian North in 1899. This book heralds in northern Saskatchewan. And it's on the route to this tour. Other images in that collection. Sounds like a lot of time. It really does take longer than a few minutes. You can see from this view. It's always a joy to find images I haven't seen. This is painting of Coquihalla just behind her. And the painter is Henry Tasker. Okay, I'll repeat my last paragraph. As you can see from this photo, not this one, no, I won't. Coquihalla, yes, that's the Coquihalla. Just to let you know, I also do find good images in the British Columbia archives, and it's always a joy to find images I haven't seen before. This is a painting of the Coquihalla River just behind Hope. And the painter is Henry Tasker Taylor. I like his work, and it reproduces well, even in black and white. but I had no idea who he was. And I still don't know much about him. His in Victoria. It's not moving.
Okay. Right. There we go. Thanks.
Okay, as you might know, the HBC's Brigade Trail in the 1850s led up the Coquihalla River, which is the first Tasker Taylor painting I showed you. The image I am showing you now is of the Coldwater River, which is at the top of the hills and across the plateau that lies above and behind the Boston Bar when you are looking towards the east. For a few years, the brigade climbed that hill from the Anderson River, which flows into the Fraser at Boston Bar, to the Coldwater River, which flows into the Nicola River at Merritt, BC. When in 1848, the men in the HBC Brigades finally reached the Coldwater River, they knew they would make it safely home to Kamloops. The Hudson's Bay Company Archives is a given for me, writing what I wrote. The Archives has a rich and varied photograph collection consisting of more than 100,000 photographs in a wide range of formats, from prints to negatives to slides. The collection was begun by the Beaver magazine in 1920. They commissioned different photographers to create different images depending on what story was being told. Readers also donated photographs, and so did descendants of the fur traders or HBC employees. So it sounds good. However, how do we order an image from the HBCA? If you look at the Archives of Manitoba Hudson's Bay House Library photograph collection, you will see all the photos listed. You can click on the little arrow to the right of the listing and see what the collection consists of. The image itself will never pop up. They're not scanned in. However, if you know what image you want, because it has been published in, say, the Beaver magazine or anywhere else or on a web page, you can go to the list, find the image, and order it. The Hudson's Bay Company Archives web pages also uses many of their own images, so that helps. I was lucky. I wanted images of York boats, and by pure chance, I stumbled on a book about the York boats that contained the best of the HBC's York boat images. And that's how I ordered the photos I did order from the Hudson's Bay Company Archives. If you are writers, however, few of you will be looking for fur trade images, and so you can just ignore the Hudson's Bay Company Archives. So I'm coming to the end of my allotted time. I have one more image to show you that will turn out to be 3 or 4 images. This is the Tulameen River, east of the town of Tulameen. The mountain rising on the other side of the river is the Tulameen Plateau, which most of you will call the Coquihalla. In 1848, the HBC Brigades rode over that mountain from Tulameen to Fort Hope in modern-day Hope, BC. I'm quite fond of this image. And part of the reason for that fondness is knowing who the photographer was. This photograph was taken in July 1888 by geologist George Mercer Dawson. The photo is in the Library and Archives Canada and is part of the Geological Survey of Canada collection. And this is George Mercer Dawson. In 1858, when he was still a young man, Dawson had a serious illness, likely tuberculosis of the spine. The disease deformed his spine and upper body and stunted his growth, which made his later accomplishments as an explorer all the more amazing. He attended McGill University and the Royal School of Mines in London, training in geology, natural history, paleontology, metallurgy, and more. He joined the Geological Survey of Canada, and he spent 2 years in British Columbia in, say, 1875-76. There, he met my great-grandfather, A.C. Anderson, and convinced Anderson to send a copy of one of his maps to the 1876 Philadelphia exhibition, the largest world exhibition of the time. After the exhibition closed, the map was displayed in the headquarters of the Geological Survey of Canada, where it eventually disintegrated. This second copy of A.C. Anderson's map comes from the BC Archives. It's a personal favorite of mine. It shows where A.C. Anderson worked his entire life in New Caledonia and on the Columbia River. And it also shows where A.C. Anderson's brother, James Anderson, of whom I spoke earlier, followed the Great Fish River north from the Great Slave Lake to the Arctic Ocean in 1855. So now you know a little of the work that goes into finding images for our books, and how much of an adventure it is as well. I looked at Library and Archives Canada once again and discovered that George Mercer Dawson, of whom I have just spoken, worked in the Yukon and took the photographs of the Pelly River and the Yukon where Robert Campbell worked. I did this search in an idle moment, and I was richly rewarded for my curiosity. And for the writer, that's really what it's about. It's a challenge to find the perfect image, but when you do, it's a thrill. The rewards are worth the risk. It gives you such a good feeling to know that you have found the best image there is to find, and that you won't have to look at an archives and find an even more perfect image that was there for the taking and you didn't see it. And believe me, that happens. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Nancy. Megan, could you turn off the recording, please?